Welcome back to Chapter 3 of The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe. Last week, I asked you to make a prediction about what you thought would happen next. Did you do that? Let's see if you were right. Chapter 3, Edmund and the Wardrobe. Lucy ran out of the empty room into the passage and found the other three. "It's all right," she repeated. "I've come back." "What on earth are you talking about, Lucy?" asked Susan. "Why," said Lucy in amazement, "haven't you all been wondering where I was?" "So you've been hiding, have you?" asked Peter. "Poor old Lou, hiding and no one noticed. You'll have to hide longer than that if you want people to start looking for you." "But I've been away for hours and hours," said Lucy. The others all stared at one another. "Batty," said Edmund, tapping his head. "Quite batty." "What do you mean, Lou?" asked Peter. "What I said," answered Lucy. "It was just after breakfast when I went into the wardrobe, and I've been away for hours and hours and had tea, and all sorts of things have happened." "Don't be silly, Lucy," said Susan. "We've only just come out of that room a moment ago, and you were there then." "She's not being silly at all," said Peter. "She's just making up a story for fun, aren't you, Lou? And why shouldn't she?" "No, Peter, I'm not," she said. It's magic. It's a magic wardrobe. There's a wood inside it, and it's snowing, and there's a faun and a witch, and it's called Narnia. Come and see." The others didn't know what to think, but Lucy was so excited that they all went back with her into the room. She rushed ahead of them, flung open the door of the wardrobe, and cried, "Now, go in and see for yourselves." "Why, you goose," said Susan, putting her head inside and pulling the coats apart. "It's just an ordinary wardrobe. Look, there's the back of it." Then everyone looked in and pulled the coats apart, and they all saw, Lucy herself saw, a perfectly ordinary wardrobe. There was no wood and no snow, only the back of the wardrobe with hooks on it. Peter went in and rapped his knuckles on it to make sure that it was solid. "A jolly good hoax, Lou," he said, and came out again. "You really have taken us in. I must admit, I half believed you." "But it wasn't a hoax at all," said Lucy. "Really and truly. It was all different a moment ago. Honestly it was, I promise." "Come, Lou," said Peter. "That's going a bit far. You've had your joke. Hadn't you better drop it now?" Lucy grew very red in the face and tried to say something, though she hardly knew what she was trying to say, and burst into tears. For the next few days she was very miserable. She could have made it up with the others quite easily at any moment, if she could have brought herself to say that the whole thing was only a story she'd made up for fun. But Lucy was a very truthful girl, and she knew that she really was in the right. She couldn't bring herself to say this. The others, who thought she was telling a lie, and a silly lie too, made her very unhappy. The two elder ones did this without meaning to, but Edmund could be spiteful, and on this occasion he was spiteful. He sneered and jeered at Lucy and kept on asking her if she'd found any other countries in other cupboards all over the house. What made it worse was that these days ought to have been delightful. The weather was fine, and they were out of doors from morning till night, bathing, fishing, climbing trees, and lying in the heather. But Lucy couldn't properly enjoy any of it, and so things went on until the next wet day. That day, when it came to the afternoon and there was still no sign of a break in the weather, they decided to play hide-and-seek. Susan was it, and as soon as the others began to hide, Lucy went into the room where the wardrobe was. She didn't mean to hide in the wardrobe, because she knew that would only set the others talking again about the whole wretched business, but she did want to have one more look inside it, for by this time she was beginning to wonder herself whether Narnia and the faun had not been a dream. The house was so large and complicated and full of hiding places that she thought she'd have time to have one look in the wardrobe and then hide somewhere else. But as soon as she reached it, she heard footsteps in the passage outside, and then there was nothing for it but to jump into the wardrobe and hold the door closed behind her. She didn't shut it properly because she knew it was very silly to shut oneself into a wardrobe, even if it's not a magic one. Now, the steps that she'd heard were those of Edmund, and he came into the room just in time to see Lucy vanishing into the wardrobe. He at once decided to go in himself, not because he thought it a particularly good place to hide, but because he wanted to go on teasing her about her imaginary country. He opened the door. There were the coats hanging up as usual, and a smell of mothballs, and darkness and silence, and no sign of Lucy. "She thinks I'm Susan come to catch her," said Edmund to himself, "and so she's keeping very quiet at the back." He jumped in and shut the door, forgetting what a foolish thing that is to do. Then he began feeling about for Lucy in the dark. He'd expected to find her in a few seconds and was very surprised when he did not. He decided to open the door again and let in some light, but he couldn't find the door either. He didn't like this at all and began to grope wildly in every direction. He even shouted out, "Lucy! Lou, where are you? I know you're here." There was no answer, and Edmund noticed that his own voice had a curious sound. Not the sound you would expect in a cupboard, but a kind of open air sound. He also noticed that he was unexpectedly cold, and then he saw a light. "Thank goodness," said Edmund. "The door must have swung open of its own accord." He forgot all about Lucy and went towards the light, which he thought was the open door of the wardrobe. But instead of finding himself stepping into the spare room, he found himself stepping into the shadow of some thick, dark fir trees into an open place in the middle of a wood. There was crisp, dry snow under his feet, and more snow lying on the branches of the trees. Overhead there was a pale blue sky, the sort of sky one sees on a fine winter day in the morning. Straight ahead of him, he saw between the tree trunks the sun just rising, very red and clear. Everything was perfectly still, as if he were the only living creature in that country. There was not even a robin or a squirrel among the trees, and the wood stretched as far as he could see in every direction. He shivered. He now remembered that he'd been looking for Lucy, and also how unpleasant he'd been to her about her imaginary country, which now turned out not to be imaginary at all. He thought she must be someplace quite close, and so he shouted, "Lucy! Lucy! I'm here too, Edmund!" There was no answer. "She's angry about all the things I've been saying lately," thought Edmund, and though he didn't like to admit that he'd been wrong, he also didn't much like being alone in this strange, cold, quiet place. So he shouted again, "I say, Lou, I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I see now you were right all along. Do come out. Make it Pax." Still there was no answer. "Just like a girl," Edmund said to himself, "sulking somewhere, won't accept an apology." He looked around him again and decided he didn't much like this place and had almost made up his mind to go home when he heard very far off in the wood a sound of bells. He listened, and the sound came nearer and nearer, and at last there swept into sight a sledge drawn by 2 reindeer. The reindeer were about the size of Shetland ponies, and their hair was so white that even the snow hardly looked white compared with them. Their branching horns were gilded and shone like something on fire when the sunrise caught them. Their harness was of scarlet leather and covered with bells. On the sledge, driving the reindeer, sat a fat dwarf, who would have been about 3 feet high if he'd been standing. He was dressed in polar bear's fur, and on his head he wore a red hood with a long gold tassel hanging down from its point. His huge beard covered his knees and served him instead of a rug. But behind him, on a much higher seat in the middle of the ledge, sat a very different person, a great lady, taller than any woman Edmund had ever seen. She was also covered in white fur up to her throat and held a long, straight, golden wand in her right hand and wore a golden crown on her head. Her face was white, not merely pale, but white like snow or paper or icing sugar, except for her very red mouth. It was a beautiful face in other respects, but proud and cold and stern. The sledge was a fine sight as it came sweeping towards Edmund, with its bells jingling and the dwarf cracking his whip and the snow flying up on either side of it. "Stop!" said the lady, and the dwarf pulled the reindeer up so sharply they almost sat down. Then they recovered themselves and stood champing their bits and blowing. In the frosty air, the breath coming out of their nostrils looked like smoke. "And what, pray, are you?" said the lady, looking hard at Edmund. My name's Edmund," said Edmund rather awkwardly. He didn't like the way she looked at him. The lady frowned. "Is that how you address a queen?" she asked, looking sterner than ever. "I beg your pardon, Your Majesty, I didn't know," said Edmund. "Not know the Queen of Narnia?" cried she. "Ha! You shall know us better hereafter. But I repeat, what are you?" "Please, Your Majesty," said Edmund, "I don't know what you mean. I'm at school. At least, I was. It's the holidays now." That's the end of chapter 3. Was your prediction right? My prediction was not right. I did not imagine all of that was going to happen. Let's talk about Edmund. Do you remember meeting Edmund for the first time in chapter 1? What did you think of him then? He was described as being a bit tired and grumpy, wasn't he? And he was in a bad mood about the weather. He was in a bad mood about Susan. What do you feel about Edmund in this chapter? Well, the narrator actually uses a word to describe him: spiteful, full of spite. Now, if we don't know what that means, we can look at the context, and it says that the other two, Peter and Susan, were making Lucy feel unhappy by not believing her story about being in Narnia, but that Edmund was, and that they didn't do it on purpose. They didn't want to make her unhappy, but that Edmund was being spiteful. And so spiteful is trying to make her unhappy, deliberately, on purpose, trying to make her unhappy. What else can we infer about the character of Edmund from this chapter? Do you notice how different his experience of Narnia is from Lucy's experience? When he doesn't like the cold silence, the eeriness of it, and yet Lucy is a little frightened, but she's also inquisitive and excited. And how can we infer that Edmund is frightened beyond the fact that the author says that he doesn't much like being alone in this strange, cold, quiet place? How do we know more that he doesn't like being alone? What does he do? He calls for Lucy, the girl that he's been belittling, berating about her imaginary land. He calls for her because he doesn't want to be alone. So you can see that the narrator is contrasting their two characters from the way that they react to being in Narnia. How else does the narrator use how Lucy behaves and how Edmund behaves to contrast their characters? What does Lucy do? And the narrator repeats this. Now he repeats this again. He or she repeats this again in this chapter. What it's very sensible or silly not to do. Sensible to do or silly not to do. To close the wardrobe door behind you. What does Edmund do? Therefore, what's the narrator telling us without telling us about Edmund? That he's silly, and that Lucy, by comparison, is sensible. So already we're starting to see these different characters appearing through this contrasting technique. Now, as Edmund is contemplating leaving Narnia, this white, red-mouthed, tall woman appears on a sleigh with a dwarf and 2 reindeer. And Edmund does not know who she is. But we do know who she is. Why do we know who she is? Because of Lucy's conversation with the faun, we know that she must be the White Witch who rules Narnia. Now, we know this already, but Edmund doesn't. And we call this narrative technique dramatic irony, because we know something that Edmund does not. And what do we know about his situation right now? He's alone in Narnia with this woman, and we know what she does. He's vulnerable, isn't he? And he doesn't know that this cocksure boy from before is suddenly in a very vulnerable position. Now, does your feeling for Edmund change now that you know who he's confronting? Perhaps a little bit. We see him reduced to the frightened boy that he is. Right, let's look at some words that appeared in this passage. Hoax. Peter says that Lucy, by saying that there's a magic world in the wardrobe, is playing a hoax. It's a hoax, which is, what do you think it is? To pretend something and mislead people and have everyone believe you. It's a trick. Yeah, hoax is a trick. Another word that you may or may not have heard when you're playing games at school is the word pax. Edmund says to Lucy, let's call it pax. What does he want to do? Because they've been arguing, haven't they? They've been disagreeing, and Lucy's been upset with him. She said, let's call it pax. Well, pax actually comes from the Latin pax, to mean peace. So it means to make it up, to have a truce, to make peace. Well, I hope you enjoyed that reading today. What is going to happen next? So Edmund has met the White Witch of Narnia. We know what she's like. Lucy's also in Narnia. We don't know where she is. And what do you predict is going to happen next? Find someone to talk to about your ideas. Could be a pet, could be a parent, could be a toy. What do you think is going to happen next? Make your prediction. And I'll see you next time for a reading of chapter 4. Until then.